Chapter 8 of the Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, a Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Introduction. The Last Abbot of Whalley. Chapter 8 The Executioner. Dawn came at last, after a long and weary night to many within and without the abbey. Everything betokened a dismal day. The atmosphere was damp and oppressive to the spirits, while the raw cold sensibly affected the frame. All astir were filled with gloom and despondency, and secretly breathed a wish that the tragical business of the day were ended. The vast range of Pendle was obscured by clouds, and ere long the vapours descended into the valleys, and rain began to fall, at first slightly, but afterwards in heavy continuous showers. Melancholy was the aspect of the abbey, and it required no stretch of imagination to fancy that the old structure was deploring the fate of its former ruler. To those impressed with the idea, and many there were who were so, the very stones of the convent church seemed dissolving into tears, the statues of the saints appeared to weep, and the great statue of St. Gregory de Northbury over the porch seemed bowed down with grief. The grotesquely carved heads on the spouts grinned horribly at the abbot's destroyers, and spouted forth cascades of water, as if with the intent of drowning them. So deluging and incessant were the showers, that it seemed indeed as if the abbey would be flooded. All the inequalities of ground within the great quadrangle of the cloisters looked like ponds, and the various waterspouts from the dormitory, the refectory, and the chapter house, continuing to jet forth streams into the court below, the ambulatories were soon filled ankle deep, and even the lower apartments on which they opened invaded. Surcharged with moisture, the royal banner on the gate drooped and clung to the staff, as if it too shared in the general depression, or as if the sovereign authority it represented had given way. The countenances and deportment of the men harmonised with the weather. They moved about gloomily and despondently, their bright accoutrements sullied with the wet, and their buskins clogged with mire. A forlorn sight it was to watch the shivering sentinels on the walls, and yet more forlorn to see the groups of the abbot's old retainers, gathering without, wrapped in their blue woollen cloaks, patiently enduring the drenching showers, and awaiting the last awful scene. But the saddest sight of all was on the hill already described, called the Holehouses. Here two other lesser gibbets had been erected during the night, one on either hand of the loftier instrument of justice, and the carpenters were yet employed in finishing their work, having been delayed by the badness of the weather. Half drowned by the torrents that fell upon them, the poor fellows were protected from interference with their disagreeable occupation by half a dozen well mounted and well armed troopers, and by as many halberdiers; and this company, completely exposed to the weather, suffered severely from wet and cold. The rain beat against the gallows, ran down its tall naked posts, and collected in pools at its feet. Attracted by some strange instinct, which seemed to give them a knowledge of the object of these terrible preparations, two ravens wheeled screaming around the fatal tree, and at last one of them settled on the crossbeam, and could with difficulty be dislodged by the shouts of the men, when it flew away, croaking hoarsely. Up this gentle hill, ordinarily so soft and beautiful, but now abhorrent as a Golgotha in the eyes of the beholders, groups of rustics and monks had climbed over ground rendered slippery with moisture, and had gathered round the paling encircling the terrible apparatus, looking the images of despair and woe. Even those within the abbey and sheltered from the storm shared the all-pervading despondency. The refectory looked dull and comfortless, and the logs on the hearth hissed and spluttered and would not burn. Green wood had been brought instead of dry fuel by the drowsy henchman. The viands on the board provoked not the appetite, and the men emptied their cups of ale, yawned, and stretched their arms, as if they would fain sleep an hour or two longer. The sense of discomfort was heightened by the entrance of those whose term of watch had been relieved, and who cast their dripping cloaks on the floor, while two or three savage dogs, steaming with moisture, stretched their huge lengths before the sullen fire, and disputed all approach to it. Within the great hall were already gathered the retainers of the Earl of Derby, but the nobleman himself had not appeared, having passed the greater part of the night in conference with one person or another, and the abbot's flight having caused him much disquietude, though he did not hear of it till the fugitive was recovered. The earl would not seek his couch until within an hour of daybreak, and his attendants, considering the state of the weather, and that it yet wanted full 2 hours to the times appointed for the execution, did not think it needful to disturb him. Braddyll and Assheton, however, were up and ready, but, despite their firmness of nerve, they yielded, like the rest, to the depressing influence of the weather, and began to have some misgivings as to their own share in the tragedy about to be enacted. The various gentlemen in attendance paced to and fro within the hall, holding but slight converse together, anxiously counting the minutes, for the time appeared to pass on with unwonted slowness, and ever and anon glancing through the diamond panes of the window at the rain pouring down steadily without, and coming back again hopeless of amendment in the weather. If such were the disheartening influence of the day on those who had nothing to apprehend, what must its effect have been on the poor captives? Woeful indeed. The two monks suffered a complete prostration of spirit. All the resolution which Father Haydocke had displayed in his interview with the Earl of Derby failed him now, and he yielded to the agonies of despair. Father Eastgate was in little better condition, and gave vent to unavailing lamentations, instead of paying heed to the consolatory discourse of the monk who had been permitted to visit him. The abbot was better sustained. Though greatly enfeebled by the occurrences of the night, yet in proportion as his bodily strength decreased, his mental energies rallied. Since the confession of his secret offence, and the conviction he had obtained that his supposed victim still lived, a weight seemed taken from his breast, and he had no longer any dread of death. Rather, he looked to the speedy termination of existence with hopeful pleasure. He prepared himself, as decently as the means afforded him permitted, for his last appearance before the world, but refused all refreshment except a cup of water, and, being left to himself, was praying fervently, when a man was admitted into his cell. Thinking it might be the executioner come to summon him, he arose, and to his surprise beheld Hal o' Nabs. The countenance of the rustic was pale, but his bearing was determined. "You here, my son?" cried Paslew. "I hoped you had escaped." "I'm in no danger, Feyther Abbot," replied Hal. "Ey'n gotten leave to visit you for a minute only, so ey mun be brief. Make yourself easy. Yo shanna die by t' hongman's hands." "How, my son?" cried Paslew. "I understand you not." "Yo'n understond me weel enough by and by," replied Hal. "Dunna be feart when yo see me next, and comfort yoursel that, whatever comes and goes, your death shall be avenged of your worst foe." Paslew would have sought some further explanation, but Hal stepped quickly backwards, and striking his foot against the door, it was instantly opened by the guard, and he went forth. Not long after this, the Earl of Derby entered the great hall, and his first inquiry was as to the safety of the prisoners. When satisfied of this, he looked forth, and shuddered at the dismal state of the weather. While he was addressing some remarks on the subject, and on its interference with the tragical exhibition about to take place, an officer entered the hall, followed by several persons of inferior condition, amongst whom was Hal o' Nabs, and marched up to the earl, while the others remained standing at a respectful distance. "What news do you bring me, sir?" cried the earl, noticing the officer's evident uneasiness of manner. "Nothing has happened to the prisoners. God's death, if it hath, you shall all answer for it with your bodies." "Nothing hath happened to them, my lord," said the officer, "but " "But what?" interrupted the earl. "Out with it quickly." "The executioner from Lancaster and his two aids have fled," replied the officer.